March 11th, 1959, New York, New York. The Ethel Barrymore Theater. In the midst of a standing ovation, the cast of a brand new play written by an unknown 28-year-old writer takes a bow. The ovations do not wither, they only grow louder by the moment. The cacophony of applause and roars of admiration had now shifted to a unanimous chant. They wanted the writer. More applause fills the theater as they wait for the writer to join the cast on stage. Realizing that this would not be done without force, Sidney Poitier, the 31-year-old star of the play and burgeoning A-list actor, leaps from the platform, heads over to the only person not standing, and carries her to the stage. Her name was Lorraine Hansberry. At the moment, overcome with confusion and humility, smiling ear to ear, she had no idea what the play would mean for generations to come, nor how this one play, a play in which she had to be coaxed into completing, would catapult her into being the darling of the theater world, collapsing her once obscure existence into the spotlight, while the true her, the authentic Lorraine, hid within the shadows. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, episode 4. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? These are the words of Langston Hughes, the renowned poet and writer, written in 1951. 21 years earlier, Lorraine Hansberry was born on May 19, 1930, to Carl and Nanny Hansberry in Depression-era Chicago. Unlike most children, the Hansberrys were able to provide a life which was the polar opposite of most Americans at the time, black or white. Carl was a successful real estate entrepreneur and Republican activist at the time, and when he could be, a doting father of 4. In those days, African Americans, no matter their status, were subject to the laws of the land, and even though the Hansberrys were definitely established as members of the black middle class, they were relegated to living in the same apartment building as their tenants. Lorraine's childhood was unique for the time. While most people lived scattered lives, desperate for food and money, her entire family were removed from that plight, at least monetarily. The same hands of segregation which had strangled the life and dreams out of most minorities at the time were the same hands that awakened them from what was known as the American dream. This couldn't be more evident to Lorraine. As a 5-year-old, her father purchased her a white fur coat and somehow cajoled her mother into allowing Lorraine to wear it to school. Needless to say, when she returned home, battered, bruised, with her mangled coat in hand, Lorraine had learned a lesson about poverty and struggle which she would never forget. Over time, Carl managed to secure a home in Chicago's Woodlawn area, an all-white enclave of Chicago, known for its well-kept lawns and upright citizens. Although the selling of the home to African Americans in white neighborhoods was banned, Carl believed in the law, and if the law would not protect them, intellect would. Within days, the family was frequently beaten, spat upon, cursed. Eventually, a few months later, when a large piece of mortar was thrown into their window, missing Lorraine's 7-year-old head by mere inches, Carl realized their very lives were in danger. Now, as I stated prior, Carl believed in the law. So when they were court ordered to vacate the house, he sued, eventually bringing the case to the Supreme Court. 3 years later, the case was won. And even with the win, Carl had begun to lose faith in the law, which he valued so much. He spent his life playing the game according to the rules. He did things the respectable way, graduated college, chose a career, raised a family. But in 1940 Chicago, let alone America, none of that mattered. After much thought and research, Carl decided to make a move. That move was to Mexico City, Mexico. He'd already heard rumors of Langston Hughes' father moving there and other prominent African Americans, so he figured he'd follow suit. When he arrived, he felt free, a master of his fate. That is, until his untimely death due to a cerebral hemorrhage. At the time, Lorraine, now 15, still lived in the States. Lorraine often spoke about the sadness of his death, how a man so strong, so brilliant, and respected was forced to abandon a fight that the zeitgeist would never allow him to win. 5 years later, at the age of 20, Lorraine dropped out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and moved to New York to pursue a career as a journalist. 1950s Harlem was a hotspot for Black excellence, and Lorraine's excellence seemed to emanate from her being. Within weeks, she got a sort of three-pronged job at a Pan-Africanist newspaper named Freedom. She was a receptionist, a typist, and a journalist. She also became deeply involved with the Black Left movement and the Communist Party. Over time, she became a mentee of such prominent Black leaders as Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. She wrote articles that questioned the formless villains of the age: women's equality, poverty, class, and imperialism worldwide, villains that still haven't met their maker to this day. It was around this time that Lorraine read The Second Sex, an infamous book which questioned the idea of expectations passed upon women, marriage, kids, celibacy, and the like. This book was profoundly impactful to Lorraine, and when she did decide to marry Robert Nemiroff, a Jewish songwriter and activist in the freedom movement 2 years later, her worldview had begun to fully form. Robert was committed to supporting Lorraine. After all, he left and divorced his first wife to be with her, so there was a strong investment in her own decision-making. For a time, along with Lorraine, Robert freelanced his writing and did odd jobs until by chance a windfall had come upon them. Cindy, Oh Cindy was a song written by Robert and a colleague. This song was wildly popular, eventually becoming a top 10 hit and providing enough income for Lorraine to quit her various gig work and become a full-time writer. The year was 1956. Understanding the freedom that came with money, Lorraine delved into her writing full throttle. Her days and nights were filled with coffee and cigarette smoke, bent over a typewriter trying to write something which reflected the times. This is when A Raisin in the Sun was birthed. Draft after draft, so much so that when she had given up, she simply threw the many pages all over the apartment, believing that she had somehow created a farce. Luckily, Robert had gathered the pages, waited a few days, and when Lorraine became restless from neglecting her craft, he gave her the pages and encouraged her to finish. Luckily for all of us, she did. Days later, Lorraine and Robert invited a few friends to the house for dinner. One of the guests was Phil Rose, president of Glory Records, the label that her husband worked for. After dinner and drinks had been served, Lorraine read the first draft of her new play to the guests. The overall feeling was awe. Each guest praised Lorraine's storytelling abilities and her impeccable knack for dialogue. This was apparent to everyone in the room, including Phil, who called the next day asking if he could produce the play. Phil had connections and enough money, and he believed that he could bring this play to Broadway with a little bit of work. Now, keep in mind, this was the late 1950s. Most theatrical performances that were in the mainstream used blacks as props. African Americans, when viewed for white consumption, were strictly used for entertainment purposes. You either sang or you danced. The idea of piercing into the interior lives of a black family living in a South Side tenement, let alone a play which required 10 roles exclusively for African American actors, seemed ridiculous, if not unspeakable. Nevertheless, the little play began to gain momentum, and when Sidney Poitier had signed on to play the role of Walter Younger, the lead role and patriarch of the family, Lorraine realized she had something special. January 1959, the Walnut Street Theater, Philadelphia. The first unofficial opening of a Raisin in the Sun. These were tryouts that tested the viability of a play, if it were to proceed, as well as make revisions and fix technical concerns. Over the course of tryouts, the play would transform. At first, all the attendees were white, then mixed audiences, then mostly black. A producer from New York, interested in possibly helping the play get further along on its road to Broadway, stops one of the playgoers during an intermission, and he asks her, "Why pay $4 to see Sidney Poitier at a theater when you can go see him on the silver screen for 85 cents? "Because this is about me," said the playgoer. 3 months later, on March 11th, 1959, A Raisin in the Sun opened at the Barrymore Theater in New York to rave reviews. 1 month later, the play was awarded the New York Drama Critics Circle Award for Best Play, and Lorraine was thrust into the national spotlight. For those of you who have not seen the play or any of the subsequent films, A Raisin in the Sun tells the story of the Younger family who, after the death of their father, receive a life insurance check in the amount of $10,000. Mama, the matriarch of the family and widow, decides to use the money in the best way possible, which would be to buy a home for the family in Clybourne Park, a segregated area of Chicago, while Walter would like nothing more than to use the money to open up a liquor store in an effort to free himself from the shackles of being an employee, in his case, a chauffeur. Without giving away too much, they decide to move to the white suburbs and see what life has to offer with their new neighbors. For some, this was a pleasing ending, nothing controversial, and in reality, it was an impossibility, so white audiences felt at ease. Even the FBI, who had begun surveilling Lorraine since the age of 22, saw no communist or radical ideals in the piece. In reality, for Black Americans, the ending was highly political and even frightening. After all, who knew what fresh horrors awaited the Younger family as they attempted to dwell among white society in peace? Later, after selling the film rights and being paid to write the screenplay for $350,000 total, Lorraine had found herself in elite circles. New friends, new enemies, new money. She made a conscious effort to continue her activism in the same way that she was mentored when she first arrived to New York. Publicly, she was seen as one of the most prolific African American playwrights of the time, as well as a staunch advocate of civil rights. Privately, her and Robert had been separated for years, and secretly, she had been writing articles under a pseudonym for the latter, a small publication geared towards lesbians in or out of the closet. Lorraine's sexuality was kept secret by all those who loved her, including Robert. Even the FBI had no idea that she was indeed a lesbian. She was too afraid to be public. This is a time where lists of possible homosexuals were being published and lives were being ruined on a whim. Robert was aware of how detrimental it would be if she was outed, and he made the decision to protect her and her secret from the rest of the world. The thing that makes you exceptional, if you are at all, is inevitably that which must also make you lonely. This was a journal entry written by Lorraine in 1961. Loneliness, either by choice or circumstance, had always been a permanent feature in her life. Her writing, mixed with speaking engagements, required most, if not all, of her time. And by 1963, when she had moved into a quaint home in the woods of Croton-on-Hudson in upstate New York, all of her love affairs were brief and far removed from one another. It was at the same time when she had begun experiencing stomach pains, pains that later became debilitating. During doctor's visits with Robert and several tests, she was given a mild diagnosis of Crohn's disease and given medicine and rest as a prescription. This was a small setback, but by 1963, America was ablaze with Southern protests and white flight. The civil rights movement was in full swing, and Lorraine felt that she had to do her part. Days after having a secret meeting about race relations with Robert F. Kennedy, Attorney General and brother of President Jack Kennedy, Lorraine realized that freedom, the idea of race, and even patriotism was not truly understood outside of the Black community. In order to create change, she needed to go deeper into the struggle. Enter the Freedom Rally, an event chaired by Lorraine and attended by 1,000 people. Now, this was one of the many events that she spearheaded, but this was in an effort to raise money and awareness of the struggle, particularly in the South. The event was a success. $5,000 was raised and given to SNCC, or the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This money was used to fund the purchase of a station wagon. What they believed by giving them this money was that it would kind of ease the burden of travel and provide a little safety when going from north to south. And this was basically the responsibility for the activists/workers. Now, in the midst of that, Lorraine's stomach issues began to worsen. And after several surgeries, her condition was still debilitating, to say the least. Later that year, in August of 1963, Lorraine, forced to stay home and recuperate after another surgery, watched the March on Washington on TV. It pained her not to be present, but she knew that as a writer, her responsibility was to write, and so she did. Her goal was to complete 3 plays by the end of the year. These pieces were LeBlanc's Laughing Boy, and the one closest to completion, The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window. By March of 1964, buried in rewrites and bouts of depression, her health began to worsen even still. It was revealed to her that she did have stomach cancer. And due to the times, Robert, her estranged husband, was advised 2 years prior not to reveal it to her in the hope that she would somehow soldier on in ignorance. Now, I'm not sure why this was commonplace at the time, but in Lorraine's case, it was a sort of a blissful ignorance thing until it wasn't. By June, Lorraine had learned that the station wagon, purchased with funds raised at the Freedom Rally, had gone missing in Mississippi, along with the 3 members of the SNCC who occupied the vehicle. Their names were James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. The vehicle was later found burned. 44 days later, the bodies of the 3 men were located by law enforcement. Obviously, Lorraine was devastated, but she managed to complete The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, which went up on Broadway in October of 1964 to scathing reviews. Days later, Lorraine fell into a coma after having a violent convulsion and losing her eyesight. The cancer, primarily located in her small intestine, had completely ravaged her, but she did manage to gain her sight. From there, she was unable to completely put her thoughts to paper. Lorraine's condition worsened until finally, on January 12, 1965, at the age of 34 years old, she did pass away. Now, Lorraine, what she did anyway was she had left a legacy of activism and writing that I don't think we've seen in recent history in any way. Her subsequent plays, although not really successful, they still managed to kind of wrestle with the ideas and issues that are sort of nestled in sexuality and race and gender. And they still find a way to kind of contain her activist spirit. Lorraine was respected and she was appreciated and loved, so much so that Malcolm X, while in the midst of hiding from the Nation of Islam, stood in the snow outside in the cold just to attend her funeral with the other around 600 people that showed up. And the irony of that is 3 weeks later, Malcolm would be dead. In essence, today's episode is about the idea of expectations. In Lorraine's life, she kind of lived with the expectation of being a writer and sort of a beacon for an entire people. And even as that beacon, she wasn't able to bring forward her actual life in its totality. She sort of lived a life in sort of hidden desperation. She was a Black lesbian woman who kind of traveled around in white circles. And I'm not sure if she ever had a chance to actually be herself. And as we do on the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, we'd like to bring a fictional story which some way ties into the actual topic. And for today, I'm going to actually read a story I wrote myself, which kind of deals with the ideas of expectation. And it's a short story that I like to call, well, that I did call, Adam and Eve Make Applesauce. I will begin. We decided to skip Bible study. It wasn't a requirement anyway, just a Tuesday gathering of 10 or so jubilant youths discussing the goodness of Jesus in the dormitory rec room. Prayer was first, followed by one of the elected students leading us into a discussion about the trials and tribulations of remaining chaste amid a constant onslaught of temptation, real or imagined. It was at one of these gatherings that I met Ebony. She was short, fair-skinned, beautiful, and at the ripe old age of 19, she was seasoned. Rumor had it that she was from New York City, and before coming to campus, she lived a hard-scrabbled life on the streets of Brooklyn, fighting and dating rappers and an assortment of other exaggerations which make someone more interesting than they really are. Needless to say, hailing from the cheese-driven economy of Kenosha, Wisconsin, she was out of my league. In high school, while most of my friends told stories about going all the way with some poor girls who thought they loved them, I simply listened, smiled, and like most virgins, pretended to be all too familiar with the coital arts. The reality was, I had no girlfriend to speak of and no prospects. The thought of even kissing a girl was too much to bear, let alone having real live sex, and due to my strict religious upbringing, the conversation was an impossibility with anyone other than my sinner friends. Teenagers were supposed to be satisfied with the comforts of the Lord, waiting on Him to provide the mate of His choosing. This was the only way to avoid falling into the cycle of debauchery that all of the adults around us seemed to be steeped in a former life. Therefore, I entered college the same way I exited high school, a virgin, pure, set apart, chosen by God, the God of the universe, as an example of His grace in a world full of sin and iniquity while living in a co-ed dorm. None of the so-called hot girls went to Bible study. One or two would show up once or twice after a bad breakup or a pregnancy scare, but over time they would slither back into their sinful ways. This was unfortunate for me and the other handful of male attendees. In our mind, this was our potential wives being led astray. And from experience, I knew that although I saw them at their weakest moments, weeping and praying for forgiveness, I'd be ignored if I saw them on campus. After all, who wants to be reminded of the night when guilt drove them to public repentance? But Ebony was different. She showed up every week on time and ready to learn. Over time, she managed to morph from a loud New Yorker into an earnest and thoughtful Christian, able to speak on scripture with myopic zeal, the kind of zeal that came from a newcomer, and she was praised for it. Weeks passed, and before we were able to comprehend the folly of two virgins living mere feet away from each other, we were dating. This consisted of an ungodly amount of trips to the cinema, followed by goodnight hugs and kisses on the cheek. But something began to grow within us, something natural, something forbidden, something sexual. We'd exchange flirtatious glances in the halls. Our legs would graze each other during prayer, and the only thing we were able to do to sedate our impulses were to imagine that soon we'd probably be married. This was our only consolation, permitting a few lapses in judgment under the unspoken understanding that marriage was the goal. There was no issue with me waiting in her room while she took showers and turning my head as she entered the room in only a towel. There was no issue with her falling asleep in my bed after an unproductive night of studying, only to writhe around between the sheets in the wee hours of the morning before going to class. She was my wife, I, her husband. The only thing standing between that thought and reality was time and resources. Turns out she wasn't from New York at all. She was a proud resident of Rochester, New York, a small town on the opposite side of New York State. These two places were as dissimilar as one could imagine. If New York City was the Big Apple, Rochester was the Appleseed, hidden, minuscule, and often avoided. Most of the rumors about her were untrue. She was the product of a hard-working single mother, recently remarried only to have the love of her life die in a tragic car accident months before her arrival on campus. I realized how this shaped her, how the idea of love was to be treasured and cared for. Love was a golden gift from God to be girded from the patina of apathy at all costs. I felt privileged that God had chosen to bestow upon me a mate of his choosing, and not to mention a hot one who stuck around. Tuesday came. I spent my day in class. She had her work-study job, followed by a pickup basketball game with a few of her female friends. Later that day, she arrived in my room as usual to unwind and talk about the day's events. Minutes passed, then hours, and we decided to skip Bible study and go to the movies. This was a recalcitrant act. Not only were we turning our backs on our Christian duties for the night, we were also avoiding the very thing which kept us guarded against the temptations of the flesh. In the dark movie theater, we were committing a revolutionary act. We had escaped the 2 hours of guilt provided by Bible study in order to spend those hours with one another, in the dark, holding hands and stealing a few kisses underneath the flickering light of the projector. Upon arriving back at the dorms, we were bombarded with disapproving looks, voicemails, and questions. Where were you guys? Are you just getting back? This didn't bother us in the least. We had done nothing wrong and agreed to meet in my room once all the brothers and sisters of the faith had gone to sleep. Midnight came. My door was propped open, allowing her to enter without knocking. I remember lying alone in bed wondering what God thought. Was he angry? Was he concerned? Did he even care? Before I could delve deeper into self-admonishment, the sound of my door opening and closing, followed by the click of the lock, filled my ears. Ebony entered my room in sweatpants and a tight-fitting t-shirt. She wore no bra, and her panty lines were non-existent. A million thoughts raced through my mind, but I managed to remain calm, welcome her to my bed, and turn on the television. I have no idea what we watched. Our conversation oscillated from laughter about the full concern we received from our peers to cuddled kisses followed by the hastened removal of clothes. Sex was not on our minds. We longed for a deeper connection, something deeper than hugs and kisses, something deeper than words, some sacrifice that would bind us through time immemorial. The only thing we could sacrifice was our virginity. At first, we didn't realize what was happening. Our passionate meandering somehow placed me inside of her for the first time. I now knew how wars began, how kingdoms toppled, how true jealousy could spring from the soul. For the first time, I made love. I wish that I could say that it was long-lasting. I wish that I could say that it was a scene from a movie, some remarkable tale of prowess that I could cling to in my old age, but 20 seconds later, it was over. She began to cry. I was too far in panic and ecstasy to console her. Moments later, the weight of what we had done hit us. We had sinned. Our God has turned his back on us. The angels mourned in disgust. Not only had we let down our Creator, but we had also let down our fellow Christians. If only we had gone to Bible study. If only we hadn't toyed with our chastity. But it was too late. The deed was done. The only thing we could do now was stew in our own iniquity. After minutes of silent agony, Ebony gathered her clothing, hugged me goodbye, and hurried to her room. I lied in bed alone, mourning the end of something that I thought would be the gift that I would present to my wife. I wondered, what was she doing? Was she still crying? Would she ever speak to me again? Was she pregnant? I also wondered why my entrance into her body was so easy. I heard stories from other women about how painful it was when they lost their virginity. Tales of agony and blood and careful penetration. That wasn't the case. In fact, judging by her moans, she had been here before. The only one that had lost their virginity was me. The tears she cried weren't from lost innocence, but from found deceit. She was exposed and the jig was up. My heart palpitated. My breathing became uncoordinated. Ebony lied to me. The next day, I awakened with a strange sense of newness. Women who I viewed as my friends were now some sensual gatekeepers of insanity. They had the power to control me, and they knew it. A reverence and contempt that I had never experienced before had emerged in me, and I knew there was no way of reversing what I had knowledge of. Did all men know this? Was I some pawn in a chess game that had been going on for centuries? The answer, of course, was yes. Later that evening, Ebony came to my dorm. She still held her beauty, her strength. But between us, something had changed. I now understood the biblical story of Adam and Eve with a depth I had never imagined. Adam ate the apple not out of disobedience, not out of rebellion, but because he loved Eve. His love for her allowed his vision to be blurred to the point of hallucination. This was a shared mirage, which allowed them to ignore the God of heaven and do the one thing that no one had ever done before: be human. Thank you for joining me on the 4th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. If you'd like to read more or see more concerning Lorraine Hansberry, you can find a documentary called Sighted Eyes, Seeing Heart, or you can read a book written by the incomparable Imani Perry entitled Looking for Lorraine. The overall crux of this episode is to be mindful of expectations. Expectations can either resurrect you or bury you. And having said that, if you do have any emails or questions or concerns, you can always email me at swtomail@gmail.com. Once again, that is swtomail@gmail.com. Till next time, be mindful of the stories you tell yourself.